Thanks so much for inviting me to speak, and to Holly for convening this really lovely series. It's sort of a bit of a treat for me because my work is so much concerned with loss and mourning and grief that I very, very rarely get the chance to talk about more light-hearted matters. Now, I'm going to disappear behind my slides. You will know the score for that. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is the title. You have 30 centuries from the date of this poem to complain, finding the comic through contemporary poetry. And actually, also, I'm really sorry if you can hear a sort of whirring noise. I'm afraid it's my elderly laptop because it's very, very hot in my room up here facing south, and it seems to have decided to whir like a hoover. Okay, so I'd like to start this afternoon, rather fittingly, with an old joke, by which I don't mean a joke that you'll have heard before many times, but one that you almost certainly won't have done. And it's one that has passed its sell-by date by around about 80 years. It was one of my dear late father-in-law's oft-told jokes, and it dates back to when he was a young man in the 40s. And it's reminiscent of one of those old sort of picture postcard seaside, saucy seaside postcards. And I think you can see I've got one here. I think they're mostly painted by Donald Gill. Anyway, it goes like this. Vicar rushing into January stores. Quick, quick, my chimney is on fire. I need some salt. Shop assistant, blonde, buxom, absolutely of course. Would you like a block? Vicar. Oh no, no time for that now, young lady. I've got a fire to put out. Okay, so this is like a joke, only not as funny. And that is because straight away there are 4 things that you need to know in order to be able to understand it, let alone laugh. Now the first one is quite obvious. Everyone had coal fires in the 1940s, not central heating, and chimneys often caught on fire. The second is that the remedy was to put salt on the fire, on the flames to dampen them down. The third point is that salt was sold not just in packets in those days, but in blocks. And fourthly, that blocks was 40s kind of 50s slang for having sex. And in fact, even in the 1980s, when my husband was a rookie journalist on the Bristol Evening Post, they weren't allowed to use the word block in headlines because it was considered rather rude. So, we can see that humour goes out of fashion very, very quickly, and it dates, which provides a huge issue for us who are trying to translate or to rewrite jokes that aren't 80 years old, but 2,000 years old. So, let's go back to the 1st century CE and Catullus, whose jokes I think can often seem like the sort of Roman equivalent of the saucy seaside postcard. As I discovered when I translated his shorter poems from my 2004 collection, Catullus Poems of Love and Hate. So I'm just going to give you a few little examples here from Catullus's jokes. The first example is from Catullus 84, in which the poet casts a satirical eye on a new craze, the young Roman men about town. And that is for aspirating vowels, for adding H's to them, in order to make them sound more Greek. And that seems to have been the fashion. So we have here on the left a literal translation of the first opening 4 lines, would read as follows. Chomodius, Arius would say, whenever he wanted to say commodious, and for insidious, and then hoped that he had spoken wondrously, enunciating as forcibly as he could. Now, our first difficulty here is that today we might expect jokes to be made about the exact opposite, that is, somebody who drops their H's as a mark not of sophistication, but of supposed vulgarity. Secondly, of course, as I've just said, we need to know some of the cultural background here. The background to Catullus' jibes that aristocratic young Romans were allegedly obsessed with Greek culture, which the older generation considered still degenerate or effeminate or whatever. But nevertheless, we know it still does work. In translating the lines, as you can see on the right here, I rather egged the pudding by adding in more H's for comic effect. And I also used a smudge rhyme, which is a time immemorial device the humorous English verse. We say advantages. He says hadvantages. We say artifice. Arius has artifice. In fact, he hammers it out to his heart's content. Such are his aspirations to eloquence. Right. The next example comes from Catullus 39. And here is a typically Roman national stereotype which is long lost to us. And this relates to the method by which the Iberians, Celtic Iberians of Spanish, allegedly clean their teeth, and that is with their own urine. Now, here Catullus uses this as a sort of to poke fun at one Ignatius, who's a rival for Lesbia's affection, loathed rival. Here we have the literal false translation. Now, you're a Celtic Iberian, and in the Celtic Iberia land, early in the morning, they urinate and scrub their teeth and pinky gums with it. So the higher the polish on your teeth, the more it proclaims that you have drunk your urine. Well, we all get the gist. In my translation, again, I used rhyme to underscore the humour. I also delayed the sort of vulgar expression for urination until the final word for more emphasis. Now, consulting J.R. Adams's inexpensible volume, The Latin Sexual Vocabulary, I learned that the Latin verb that we have at mincet, or mingo, is what he deems the basic as opposed to an obscene word for urination. Okay, so this is what we have. But in Iberia, and you're Iberian, whatever water gets passed in the morning is used to bleach the teeth, reddened round the rims. So the yet more dazzling your foolish smile is, the more we'll know you have drunk of your own piss. Now, my final example is from Catullus 22, in which the poet mocks the literary aspirations of the amateur, very rich would-be poet Aristophanes. Now, he's a character we can all sort of identify with, the rich man playing at either being the writer with his expensive notebooks, fine binding, and so on. But the poem ends with a very, very specific cultural reference on which its final joke sort of turns. And it derives from one of Aesop's fables, which tells how the gods give men two manticae or double knapsacks, one worn on the front, which contains others' faults, the one we can see, and the one worn on the back, carried on our backs, which contains our own faults, which we can't see, but everybody else can. The literal reads here, still we are deceived the same, nor is there any man in whom you can't see some sort of suppleness. Each of us has his assigned faults, but we don't see what's in the knapsack on our back. In a way, this is perhaps the most difficult example of all these three, and yet when I hit upon a solution, it seemed obvious, if in itself perhaps also time limited. Still, we've all had the same failing, all felt, we know or act for suppleness ourselves. We all look ahead, know but half the facts, can't see the baggage that's on our own backs. Now, overall, we can see how in all of these examples, just stepping away from the literal, if only slightly, can hopefully help to reanimate Catullus's very old jokes. Right, well, I want to go back further in time now to Aristophanes' satirical masterpiece Nights, produced in Athens in 44 BCE, 2,500 years ago. And there we go. Now, as many of you are going to know, the play is based around a central political conceit or allegory, in which the demos of Athens, that is, those in the city who are entitled to vote, is characterised as the master of a city household. The leading politicians of the day are then cast as his slaves, trying to vie for his favour. As the play opens, one of these, a brash new slave called Palladas, based on the Athenian demagogue Cleon, who, as everyone will know, Aristophanes had serious beef with, has gained the master's affections through flattery and promises, using wiles and schemes he's stolen from the other slaves. And so his rivals hit upon a scheme to find the lowest of the low, a market trader, a vulgar sausage seller called Demos Quittus, the people's judge, who can challenge Paphlagons' underhand ways of gaining power and so set their master back on the right path, the old traditional ways of Athenian political life. Now, obviously, as such, Knights is very, very hard to translate, because every page, almost every line of the play is stuffed full with almost impenetrable references to the cut and thrust of Athenian politics of the day. To translate it literally is rather like translating an episode of Have I Got News for You or Spitting Image 2,500 years from now, and expecting an audience to understand it without an accompanying set of footnotes the size of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, to give you an idea of the difficulties, I'd like first of all to read you a short extract of the play in a literal prose version. It's taken from a scene in which Cleon the Paphlagon and the sausage seller Demos Quittus compete for the favour of their master Demos on the doorstep of his house, and it's perhaps one of the more accessible exchanges. And in this, Polly is going to play Demos Quittus, the sausage seller, and Eleanor, I think, if you're there, is going to play Demos. So I'll be Cleon. Demos, convene the assembly at once to decide which one of us loves you best and give your favour to them.
Yes, yes, do choose, only not on the Pnyx.
I could not sit anywhere else. It is there that you must appear before me.
I pray to Athena, guardian goddess of our city, that if it's true that no one has done so much good for the Athenian people as I, apart, of course, from Lysicles, Cinna, and Salabuco, let me continue to be fed at the town hall in return for doing nothing. But if I hate you, Demos, if I alone am not ready to fight in your defence against all comers, then may I perish, be sawn to bits alive, and have my skin cut up into thongs.
As for me, Demos, if it isn't true that I love and cherish you, may I be cooked in a stew, and if that's not enough, may I be grated on this table with some cheese and then mashed, and then may I be dragged by the balls to the cemetery.
Is it possible, Demos, to love you more than I do? For as long as you have governed with my consent, have I not filled your treasury, putting pressure on some, torturing others, unswayed by the opinion of private individuals, and anxious only to please you?
There's nothing wonderful, Demos. I can do the same and more. I will steal other people's bread to serve up to you. No, he has neither love nor compassion. His only care is to warm himself with your firewood, and I will prove it. Sword in hand, you saved Attica from the Persians at Marathon, you whose glorious triumphs we love to praise unceasingly. But look, he cares so little for you, he has you seated uncomfortably on a stone, whereas I bring you this cushion sewn with my own hands. Yes, try this nice soft seat. Did you not put enough strain on your rear at Salamis?
Thank you both. Okay, we can see how time and culturally specific these references here are, taking in current Athenian public figures about whom we often now know barely anything. But we can also see how Aristophanes' humour works, and appreciate that the satire isn't really so much different from ours. We have the same sort of jokes at the politician's expense, such as the references to Paphlagon and leatherworking. One of Aristophanes' favourite sort of jibes at Cleon was that his family had made their money in the tanning industry, which I suppose is rather like the jibes at Gavin Williamson being a fireplace salesman, or going further back, John Major's father being a circus performer. We also have some fantastical descriptions, such as Demos Quittus, the sausage seller, imagining himself being made into one of his own sausages. This is reminiscent, say, of a Peter Brooks or a Steve Bell cartoon of Boris Johnson as Big Dog, or being turned into his own Brexit battle bus. But how do we present this to a contemporary audience? This was a dilemma I had to grapple with when I was commissioned to do a reworking of Knights for BBC Arts Council Write Out Loud project. Some of its scenes were performed on the night of the 2001 election, which Tony Blair won for Labour, as part of a series on dangerous translations at the South Bank Centre, London. And so, for this. the action was transported from the Athenian winter of 44 BCE to London in early June 2001 CE. And Aristophanes' chorus of knights, the upper-class strata of Athenian society, which gives the play its name, became the members. You can see the members of Parliament, which also has a kind of rather lovely saucy overtones, I think. The play's setting was changed from the Athenian Pnyx, where the assembly met, to Westminster, and a house belonging not to Demos, but to the gruff aristocrat, so electorate. Next, the brash Catholic Cleon became Blairon, based, of course, on the lady leader Tony Blair, also often accused of stealing his opponent's ideas. And the vulgar sausage seller Denis Kritos, plucked from the gutter to provide a challenge to Blairon, became Prescott Critters, based on Blair's deputy John Prescott, who was famously straight-talking and often dubbed the most working class of Blair's cabinet. Prescott, as you may or may not remember, was very, very proud of his background in the Merchant Navy, where he worked as a bar steward, which straight away has quite a nice saucy ring to it. And meanwhile, the sort of normal literal prose translation became rhyming couplets, which echo Aristophanes' neat demotic verse in the scene. And again, Polly and Eleanor, I think, are going to help me with this scene. From the members, London, Thursday, 7th of June 2001, the doorstep of Sir Electorate's townhouse in Westminster. Sir Electorate, we need a snap election to see which of us is your predilection, and in that man, please, place absolute trust.
Oh God, no, don't let him near a ballot.
But how else can I test the state of the nation? It can only be through the polling station.
Look, I swear, if I may, on this great country, that of all of your servants, I'm most worthy, beyond Jonathan Aitken, and of course, Fergie. So I'll lap up your warm support, your cheering, collect my due respect for doing nothing. And if I'm wrong, I'll change my marketing.
Right, Sir Electorate, if I don't love you best, I'll serve short measures and still get you wrecked. And if not, grab my balls, do me for fraud and put me in that MP's graveyard, the House of Lords.
Yeah, well, how could anyone, love you more? Just read my manifesto, if you like being gored. You'll soon see what sort of pension sums I offer. Okay, I put the books. But is that improper?
Well, if that's what needed, I can do it too. Top up your drinks with watered down Van Rouge. But if anyone throws an eggnog, gets me stoked, I'll punch him out and say I were provoked. But here's the rub, Blairon doesn't love you, and you only care for him, give him the election because of all his false promises about your pension. But you fought the poll tax in Trafalgar, a victory still sung about in social club bars. But if you're tired, does he care? Not a bit. He doesn't want you to scratch your 5-year itch. He lets you perch on a hard, damp bollard, abandons you to the confusion of the ballot card. So I've brought you a bar stool, somewhere to sit, to rest the aching butt Thatcher once kicked.
Thank you both. Now, that was really fun to write, and also it was to perform. As you can see, my aim was to have my English correspond joke for joke, line for line, with Aristophanes' original Greek, and as such, I would say that it's actually a fairly literal translation in its own way. But I think we can also see the issue here. 22 years on, a good deal of the then contemporary politics is teetering on the edge of memory. Who remembers MP Jonathan Aitken's disgrace after being jailed for perjury? Or the finer details of Blair's pension reform and all the hoo-ha about them? Or even John Prescott being egged by a protester during the election campaign, whom he then punched back in the face at those very, very different times. So what is the answer? Should we treat knights like an episode of Spitting Image as being very, very time-specific? And the original concept for the Arts Council project was that the script would be rewritten, or could be rewritten, for any subsequent performance, if necessary, to reflect current events. Or should versions perhaps aim to be wider, vaguer, so they don't lose their sell-by date, or concentrate on another era of well-known history, like a sort of Athenian Blackadder? This is perhaps something that we can discuss later together at the end. But 15 years later, in 2014, I had to consider such questions again. I was commissioned to present some new responses to the 4th century CE epigrammatist Palladas for an international conference on the poet held at UCL. Now, Palladas is famous, or rather infamous, for his misogyny, and reading his work can feel a bit like being forced to listen to endless mother-in-law jokes from an end of the pure comic. So the first thing I wanted to do was to open a dialogue with the text, to let the silent women he addresses and sort of uses talk back. So I've just got 2 short examples to show you here, both based on poems from the Greek anthology rather than the later discovered fragments. The first is from Greek anthology 11287, which we can see on this slide, and it translates literally as, "Cursed with an ugly wife, when he lights the evening candles, he still sees only gloom." And I have to say that when I googled this for text, the first thing that came up was the heading patriarchal male fantasy. So on the right-hand side here, you can see what I imagined that woman, that wife, might have to say in response to her particular charmer of a husband. Holding a candle. When I hear his step on the stair, see the flicker of the evening light on his yellow teeth or thinning hair, as he peers into that gloomy night, I turn my face to the peeling wall. I think of the lips of my first love, while he snores on or snuffles off. These are my dreams, sweet, youthful. He couldn't even hold a candle. And in this, what I was trying to do was to turn Palladas' misogyny on its head by a sort of transgressive translation and switch his literal candles for a figurative modern expression which holds a candle to. My second example here is from Greek anthology 9773, and it's a very famous epigram of Palladas, which has often been taken to refer to the triumph of Christianity over paganism. And here the poet imagines a statue of the Greek god of love, Eros, being melted down into a frying pan. You can see the frying pan over here. Presumably because Eros is now sort of superfluous to requirements in a predominantly Christian world. And on the left-hand side, you can see the Greek text with the literal translation. A bronzesmith, melting down Eros, fashioned a frying pan, not unreasonably, since that too burns. Now the piece turns on this image of burning, the Greek verb phlego, used here both literally and figuratively, of passion. And as we can see, it's sort of placed at the end of the epigram for extra emphasis. But as I began to work on the poem, it occurred to me that the juxtaposition of love, frying pans and burning might have some extra resonances for women, readers particularly. For example, cooking breakfast for both their husbands, which leads on to the issue of eggs. So this was my response. From fat to frying pan. First we burned with words, kisses, promised a new life together, a few kids. And then it was, "Where's my breakfast?" Or, "I can't stand my eggs cooked like this." Time, like an alchemist or blacksmith, has hammered out love, our own Eros, shrunk it down from fat to frying pan. Never mind, now it is my turn to burn the best bacon, to waste his good eggs. Now, in both of these responses, I was trying to create more timeless pieces that would not themselves run a risk of dating too quickly. So, for example, the candle became a flickering light. In other words, it can encompass electricity too. And clearly, the bacon and eggs are a contemporary addition to Palladas' fry pan. Now, more recently, at the end of 2021, I was asked to contribute to some classical versions on the poetic life, for what was going to be the last issue of the poetry journal One Hand Clapping, which fortunately was later reprieved. And it seemed to me that the vicious satire of the 1st to 2nd century CE Roman poet Martial was sort of perfect for the task. Especially as there was kind of no one that Martial abhorred more than his fellow poets. I've just picked out a few of the short epigrams to show you here. Firstly, we have Martial 820, in which the poet satirizes a fellow poet Verus for his prolific writing habits, which takes us sort of back to Catullus and Aristophanes. So on the left-hand side, you can see, though you write 200 verses every day, Verus, you recite nothing in public. You are unwise, and yet you are wise. In my version, as you can see, I was aware that no one sort of in the poetry world, as it were, would know anything about Verus, and it might cause a sort of anxiety, thinking that they should be able to place him. So I changed Verus to Profusus, which also sounds Latin and sort of speaks for itself. Profusus writes 200 poems daily. He recites few. The first is utter folly. The second, wise move. My next example, Martial 7:3, concerns one Pontilianus, another fellow poet, who it appears has a suggestion that most poets dread and still do, and that is an exchange of books. Why do I not send you my books, Pontilianus? Lest you should send me yours, Catullus. Again, to make things easier for the more general poetry reader, I simply substituted the obscure Roman poet's name with a more generic alternative. Why don't I send you, fellow poets, my latest lines? There's a danger, fellow poets. You'll respond in kind. And finally here, we have Martial 441. And this is another sort of familiar figure, the poet who poses at their reading here in a rather thick scarf, although I have to say, as you can see, I'm rather fond of donning a scarf myself. And here's the literal. Why, when about to recite, do you wrap your neck in wool? That wool would have more proper use for our ears. Fortunately for once, this was quite easy to transfer into a modern setting. At readings, you sport a muffler, 10% cashmere. If only cotton wool could muffle our own ears. All in all, we can see that Martial satire can be carried on fairly easily to the present day with a few tweaks here and there of some of the more difficult contemporary references. Okay, I'd like to turn things around now and look at how, through classical receptions, the comic can become tragic and the tragic comic. Now, of course, this is nothing new. Homer's epics contain comic scenes, and Euripides' dramas sort of teeter between tragedy and comedy. But I first understood how delicate an issue this could be when I was working on Ovid's exile poetry from Tristia, my 2008 collection, The World for Sorrow. Now, initially, I had been drawn to Ovid's often neglected poems by what I saw as their immediacy and apparent rawness. The one instance, as I wrote, where the mask of classical literary artifice slips to reveal the raw pain of the man beneath. As such, if historically unpopular with scholars, the work has proved enticing to poets, such as Osip Mandelstam and Joseph Brodsky, as Ovid details the hardships and deprivations of an urbane poet exiled from Rome to the wintry Black Sea city of Taunus, which was then at the end of this known world. Yet, there was a yet, the more I read of and about Tristia, the more I realised that there was far more here than meets the eye. Ovid's verse is also often teasing, wry, funny, and on occasion rather tongue-in-cheek. It's a work packed full of intertextual references and sharp changes in register. So much so that one scholar came up with a theory that it wasn't written from remote Tonus, but in the relative comfort of Ovid's country home in Rome. Now, this is clearly a tongue-in-cheek a theory as the poetry it describes, but nevertheless, these were readings that I needed to incorporate into my version, and it wasn't an easy task. The collection interspersed these versions with original poems about my old second-hand dictionary being used to translate them. As I discovered very early on in research, the dictionary's original owner had fought in the disastrous First World War campaign at Gallipoli in Turkey, which Ovid had actually described passing on his way to his own place of exile. Yet at first, I wondered how I was going to handle this change of tone from high to low in the context of the war poems. I soon realised that this was exactly how the soldiers themselves wrote in their own diaries and letters home, sort of trauma one minute, humour the next. Now, as the volume went on, the Ovid versions became looser, more impressionistic. So, for instance, if we look at these two passages here that I've got on the screen, one from Tristia 5:7, which plucks out 8 of its 69 lines, stressing the poet's sense of linguistic alienation, as well as cultural isolation, with all the sort of entitlement of the colonial Rome, it should be said. And the second passage is from Tristia 5:10, in which Ovid makes a dramatic statement about its predicament. If I look at this country, I see an unappealing land. No place could be more cheerless. If I look at its human inhabitants, they are scarcely worthy of the name, with more the cruel savagery of wolves. They do not fear the force of law. Right gives way to force. Justice is conquered by the sword. A few retain traces of the Greek tongue, but even these have a Getic tweet. There is not a single man among them who might speak a Latin word, however common. I, the Roman bard, forgive me, muses, am forced to utter Sarmatian phrases, and, the shame of it, from disuse I find myself reaching with difficulty for Latin. So, the fear of losing the currency of my Latin tongue, in case my own voice should fall silent, I torture myself, revisiting disused words and seeking again the ill-omened tokens of my art. They talk in the tongue they share. I must make myself understood by gestures. Here, in the marketplace, I am a barbarian, understood by no one, as the Vitae ridicule my Latin words. Now, in the poem based on these two passages, Naso the Barbarian, I wanted to capture this mixed tone, at the same time using translation and humour to subvert and question Ovid's own colonial assumptions. So I took Ovid's reference to his Commercia Linguae in 5761, which has the same pun as in English of currency, and sort of ran with it. Meanwhile, in my version, Ovid's "Here it is the time of barbarian, barbarous but ego sum" becomes a sort of transgressional post-colonial act, self-knowledge. Naso the Barbarian. I see a world without culture, savage, bleak, a world weighted by sorrow. So men become beasts, with no fear of law, justice vanquished in war. Learning, commerce, tainted now by heated air. My own voice is spent, this poet's coinage, my native speech bankrupted and impoverished. So I talk to myself, dear and borrowed words, for this doomed art, the currency of my verse. And then, watching the tribesmen in the markets, bartering for goods in their common language, while I communicate by mime or gesture, a thought of hers. Who is the barbarian here? Okay, now for something completely different again. In my 2017 collection, The Paths of Survival, I traced the way in which a few tiny fragments of Aeschylus's lost tragic masterpiece Myrmidons have survived down through the centuries. When I was researching for the book, it was very interesting how many scraps of Aeschylus's tragedy had come down to us through comic writing. For example, Myrmidons was renowned in the ancient world for its description of the Greek Homeric hero Achilles' erotic passion for his companion Patroclus, and this is no doubt one reason why it didn't actually make it through in its entirety. And one of the most infamous lines that we still have, that still survives, has survived in a quotation from a dialogue, Erotes, or erotic tales, attributed to Lucian. Lucian lived in Syria in the 2nd century CE and is known for his comic satirical works. He wrote the first novels in Western history, including a prototype sci-fi adventure, which sees its protagonists travel to the moon, and another in which they go down to the underworld, which is sort of an early horror tale. And it takes the form of a debate on the nature of desire, and in particular it asks which is superior, homosexual or heterosexual love. So here we have a quote from Lucian, Erotes 54. And at the end of a debate on heterosexual versus homosexual love, Theomestus gives the casting vote for the latter. But not even the affection of Achilles for Patroclus was limited to sitting opposite him. No, pleasure was the mediator even of their friendship. At any rate, when Achilles was lamenting the death of Patroclus, his unrestrained feelings made him burst out with the truth and say, "I honoured the intimacy of your thighs in my laments." And this line has now become Myrmidon's fragment 1 through 6. There aren't 1 through 6 fragments of Myrmidon, there are about 10 or 12, but that's the number it's given in the text of Aeschylus. So, Lucian also wrote several parodies of Greek tragedy and a stinging request to a critic who accuses him of writing bad Greek, which is interesting because he was Syrian, and Syrian was probably the first language that was particularly stinging. And these gave me the idea that he might have had aspirations to serious writing, but took the popular route instead. So the following poem from the Parts of the Bible follows in its comic vein, was sort of tinged with a tragic regretto it could have been. Erotic tales. I thought of myself as the new Homer. But readers, I soon learned, prefer horror, sci-fi. My erotic tales pay the bills, bring in the hard cash, the boys and all girls. Even Aeschylus, known for weighty verse, dipped his nib in the ambidextrous. Such sacred communion between the thighs. Side is Achilles, of Patroclus' side, to top my list of things by furious. And who's to say I'm not as lyrical? Across the empire, at any scribe's stall, my lightweight prose is still copied 10 times more than dull, turgid tragedies. Is this a talent wasted, or career waylaid? Weighty or not, they'll remember my lines when Aeschylus' plays have long decayed. Right, next, I'd like to look at work I've only just published. It's sort of hot off the press in the latest edition of Long Poem magazine, which is out this week, I think. And it's from a sequence of poems called Blood Road, which is based on incidents in Herodotus, Thucydides, and other ancient historians' accounts of classical warfare. Now, the motivation for the series came from watching daily news feeds over the past year reporting on the violent progress of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as we indeed will have been. And in particular, this sort of realization that its atrocities, the oppression of civilians, the targeting of hospitals, the killing of children, seemed as if they belonged not to 21st century, but the brutal warfare of ancient history. Over and over, I was reminded of savage events of classical warfare. The Persian kings' ill-fated campaigns to conquer Asia Minor and Greece, including the then Scythian territory of Ukraine, or the viciously fought Peloponnesian War between Greece's two superpowers, Athens and Sparta. Now, these poems are not straight translations, but they still shadow their original Greek text as a means of approaching this sort of almost inexpressible horror of present brutalities, and discovering how this sort of relentless churn of violence rattles down through the centuries. And as such, 7 of the 8 poems in it in the sequence are sort of brutally savage and I suppose very angry, and probably as hard to read as they were to write. But the following poem, based on a passage in Herodotus book 7, offers a sort of almost sort of form of comic relief, if you can say that, in the middle of all the horror. And it tells the story of two brave Spartans who willingly volunteered to go to Persia to be executed. Now, this was in return for the previous killing of Persian envoys demanding submission from Sparta, whom the Spartans had thrown down a well and killed. And this is what Herodotus says happened next. These Spartan deeds were worthy of admiration, but so also were their sayings. On their way to Susa, they arrived at the palace of Hydarnes, a Persian, who was general of the coast of Asia. He entertained and feasted them as his guests, and as they sat at his board, he asked, Spartans, why do you shun the king's friendship? You can judge from what you see of me and my situation, how well the king can honour men of worth. So might it be with you, if you would but put yourself in the king's hands, for you are of proven worth in his eyes. So every one of you might, by his commission, be a ruler of Greece. To this the Spartans answered, your advice to us, Hydarnes, is not completely sound. One half of it rests on knowledge, but the other half on ignorance. You know well how to be a slave, but you, who have never tasted freedom, do not know whether it is sweet or not. Were you to taste of it, you would not advise us to fight for it with spears, no, but with axes. Now, when I came to write my poem, I was very struck by the Spartans' quite formal, if still passionate, defence of freedom. And that sort of rolled around in my head, and this is when I came up with the poem. Freedom of information. Asiatic coast, sometime in the summer, 480 BCE. To all it will concern, your wreck, Spart free. Dear General, thank you in advance for your information request. In this instance, we confirm your inquiry can be met. But please be aware that your question lacks balance. You speak with half the facts, the rest is ignorance. Forget the feasting, the fine wines, the rich food. You have lived only as a slave, if in lavish servitude. You will never understand freedom, can't tell its taste, the way it dissolves on the tongue like honeyed hope. Freedom. We are unable to disclose third-party data, but if you knew its sweetness, you'd beg, you'd order us to defend it not with spears, but double-bladed axe, to hack our way through a wall of bone and solid flesh by any means to hand, no matter the cost or count of lives. Caltrops, clubs, spikes, homemade bombs, kitchen knives. War's Spartan Prisoners, www.againstinvasion.org. Please note that all of the above is now in the public domain. You have 30 centuries from the date of this poem to complain. I'd like to move on to my most recent collection, 2022's Ghost Passage, which, as Polly said at the beginning, concentrates not on high art like tragedy, but on writing that stands outside our usual preconceptions of literature, and especially poetry. Stone inscriptions, graffitied everyday objects, and in particular, a trove of Roman writing tablets recently excavated in the City of London during the building of the Bloomberg headquarters at Walbrook. Now, these tell the stories of people that you don't often get to hear, the everyday lives of ordinary people in Roman London, so history and poetry from the ground up. Now, I've just got two from here, I'm getting towards the end now. Bloomberg Writing Tablet 30, for instance, is probably the first financial document ever recorded in the City of London, and it dates right back to very, very early days of the Roman occupation, around about 51, 52 CE. And we can see it here on the slide. And on the front it reads, "You will give this to Titus Aviarius," that is the poultry man, and the inside is very fragmented. Half of the line, because they are boasting through the whole market, you have lent them money. Therefore I ask you in your own interest not to appear shameless. You will not thus favour your own affairs. So, what's going on here? Well, it appears that we have an unnamed businessman writing to one Titus, presumably a fellow financier, and complaining about his overgenerous loans, which are making him a laughingstock and are not appreciated by his fellow moneylenders. It's very interesting that all of this kind of financial structure has been set up already in Roman London. And the writer also seems to sneer at his rival's name, which translates as Portuguese. Now, as we can see, it's probably not a comic piece at all. It is a cabinet poultry, which seemed to give an opportunity for a lot of chicken puns that I couldn't resist. So here, for the first time, is the accusation, followed by Titus's own imaginary, spirited response to his accusation. Pecking orders. To Titus Bird-faced poultryman, a word of caution in your own interest. Through the city, debtors are flowing, but your new bills are ever flowing. If you ruffle feathers, bring discredit, no one here will thank you for it. You won't advance by these advances, only undermine our fledgling markets. Such loans are more than we'll allow, so heed this warning, don't play foul. That night I could have heard stars touch, the sigh of fish through quicksilver river, yet somehow, I swear, I missed my latch lifting, the spike soft step of Anonymous, slipping their foul tablet beneath my door. A month ago, in Athens, I was in the Agora, debating Plato by moonlight, Pythagoras. Here, in Britain, they waste good wax and wood on weak funds, vindictiveness. These are the poultrymen, chicken food. We Greeks do not care for pecking orders. I will lay my nest eggs where I please. And I'd just like to look at one more of these tablets. This is one of the most complex tales that they have to offer. This is from writing tablet 29. And here a sort of panicked slave or freedman writes to his master to recount the story of some baggage animals that have gone missing in stewardship. We can see here, this is on the address. Taurus, which seems to be corrected to Taurinus, to Macrinus, his dearest lord, greetings in good health. And then this is the message itself, again fragmentary. When Catullus had come and took beasts of burden away, investments which I cannot replace in 3 months. Yesterday I was at the house of Diaduminus, but he, Catullus, arrived unexpectedly for a single day. So, as I say, it's a very fragmentary and confusing piece. Taurinus seems to be informing his lord Macrinus that while staying at the house of Diaduminus overnight en route, his baggage animals were nicked by the villain of the piece, Catullus. And presumably it's not just the loss of the animals that's an issue, it's also the grain that's probably carrying. Now again, as in the previous writing tablet, 30, it's clearly not meant to be comical at all. But the convoluted details sort of struck me straight away, and I have to say they brought to mind, and this is really going to age me, the very, very deliberately complex catch-up that used to launch every episode of the US TV series Soap. If anyone remembers that, it launched the Billy Crystal's career, I believe. And I also liked the sound of the names, it's Catullus. Roger Tomlin, in his incredibly exhaustive commentary on the writing tablets, says that it could derive from the Latin Taurus, for guitar, but he prefers the explanation that comes from the Celtic catu, or battle, which is rather different. However, for comic effect, I decided to go for his first thought. And the following poem is written in the voice of a fictional lawyer who, to his regret, has taken on the brief and is now desperately trying to unravel the sequence of events. The missing mules. I wish I had never taken the brief or ever heard of those dratted donkeys. To recap, they belonged to Macrinus, but Taurus or Taurinus, his lackey, had the job of transporting them from whence to Jove knows where, when one Catarius, the nosewife, snaffled them, it seems, by stealth, while Taurus, Jove knows why, was away, safe with Diogenes for a night only. Confused? Believe me, I've hardly started. Now Taurus swears he can't make recompense for the missing mules, not in 3 harvests. So here's the burning question we should ask. Does London really need another act? Okay, I want to end with a poem from 2004's Chasing Catullus, mainly because it's a very fitting place to stop. And I wrote it after working on my 1996 volume, Classical Roman Poets, on translations, during which I was struck by how often later scholars attributed the work of women writers to their male contemporary male poets. Now, this is particularly true, as many of you will know, of the contortions in which commentators tried themselves in when considering the work of the 1st century CE Roman poet, Sophocles. Much of this has subsequently been attributed to her male contemporary Catullus. And in fact, it's actually even more complex than that. Those who believed Sophocles' poetry was written by a woman decried her poetry's simplicity and lack of skill. Those who thought the work was highly proficient then tended to the view that it must have been written by Catullus instead. But this is the thing. Feminine ending, as if Catullus wanted to show her how it could have been done. Midnight in Rome, summer, the year 1. You're going home. The party's fading fast. You've defiled aediles, procured a procurator, got a handful of jokes past the stern new censor, was not amused when you declined his parts. Even the emperor, not noted for humour, puts your best up with, let's think, Catullus. All right, the man's a bore, a pain, a total prick. There could be worse ways to share a Florence. A whole new world now, new empires to crush. You see, you're famous, a star, fated genius. But empires fold, dates blur, years move on, and you're marginalised, anthologized, just. You've evaded vandals, survived the Huns, got a handful of poems, plus the monks and nuns, if they still remove each sarcophagus. Even academia, not noted for its humour, puts yours best down to, let's think, Catullus. All right, you know the score, the same old caveat. Your work can't exist, and if it did, it's trash. Just the way of the world, survival of the fittest. You see, your name ends in R, and they want us. Thank you very much, everybody.